Hey folks, welcome to my long overdue big behind the scenes video. I decided to actually make the darn thing now since my Dorado Scene is finally done, and while it isn't doing as well as I originally had hoped, it will still probably lead to more eyes on my channel, and then this video will act as sort of a gateway to some of my other animations. The El Dorado video was a bit of a step up from my usual animations, in the sense that I sculpted a ton for it. The characters were initially sketched out with basic ideas, and then I made simple blockouts for them, and then I went in and sculpted the mesh and applied the rig. The shaman's hands actually belong to Harriet. The environments were pretty similar, except I didn't sketch them. So the interior went through a few more steps in the mock-up stage before I figured out how to make it look better. The stone tablet also took a lot of time, with a few different approaches. I tried sculpting the stone, it didn't look that good. I added the decal by sketching out 3 different layers, and then importing them as a empty, converting them to a drawing or a path, converting them to a mesh. I forget exactly how I did it. But that didn't really look right either. I tried embossing it, where I made the outline more pop out compared to the center. That didn't look very good, so I just ended up sticking it to a different color. Also in the background of the interior, I added in the TV from the Toy Story 2 scene in the background. For the exterior, I've sculpted a few choice skulls and arranged them across the slabs with geometry nodes that made each one a little bit different from the one that came before. Once the rendering was finished, I decided to add some color correction, which pretty much just boosted the contrast. Which of the versions do you prefer? The music was done by me trying to emulate the song from the original. The sound effects are from a number of different sources, all set up in FL Studio. On the topic of collab scenes, I don't know if I talked much about the Toy Story 2 scene, or if there's even much to talk about with it. Each character was made with the skin modifier. The TV cycled through my prior animations, and to achieve the chorus effect for Mr. Potato Head, I recorded the phrase "wait, go back" like 20 times and layered them all. It's pretty unique in being one of the few animations that doesn't star humanoids exclusively, I think. Might be the only one. I don't know. Those are the animations where I copied material. But did you see the animations where I copied a style? It started with Fish Bubblin, a cute fish animation where I sculpted basic fish shapes and animated them over a little felt backdrop. The animation of it being whisked away was done with the animal tool, applying squash and stretch. And they didn't have rigs, they were just animated as the mesh. In that same style, I also made Frog Worker. Frog Worker! This animation got pretty big on Newgrounds. And pretty big on YouTube as well. The same felt background as Fish Bubblin, but the model was sculpted and rigged properly. The cool squash and stretch animation was done by just having a basic subdivided cube swirl around the chair, also animated with animal. And the sound effects were from Frogger 2! Another worker starred in Working Man. This animation reused models from Don't Care, and at the end, I got sick of animating and dropped a giant block on the red guy. More interesting about the animation, I think, is the background, which was heavily inspired by the backgrounds in El Toro 64's Gary's Mod animations. I don't know why recording this video makes my jaw hurt. Speaking of interesting backgrounds, my animation, The Ultimate Collectables, probably has my favorite environment in any animation I've ever done. That's the science lab. I made concept art for some of the machines and slowly adjusted it all to fit a good looking style that ended up barely being visible in the finished animation. Just flew right by. Each machine has a piece of a mannequin from Dead Rising in them. Cool. The other environments took much less time, especially the last scene, which I started after I had finished animating and rendering all of the other scenes. The park went through a few design iterations, and the movie theater is also pretty good to look at. Of course, the robots are all models that I downloaded from Models Resource with slight modifications. But creating robots, that's kind of like playing God, right? Just like my animation creation. That's the animation that got me into the Dorado collab. It's also a project where I recorded the process of working on it, making the animation of the clump becoming humanoid. So what I did with this is I animated in A-Sprite and then imported it into Paint 3D and traced it out to make the shapes 3D. And then after that I used I followed a tutorial for lip syncing. I'll leave the one that I used in the description below because I don't really know how it works necessarily, but basically it's a geometry node setup where you match an ID to a node group, and then it cycles through, like, if the ID is the same, change the object to this. It's a bit complicated, so yeah. Beyond that, some reused assets from Cloud and some simple environments. Okay, I had a sweet segue here to talk about Idea Guy, completely forgetting that I had already made a video on how I did Idea Guy. So let's just look at Car Walker and Flamethrower instead. Car Walker was me making an interesting visual and then trying to find out what the actual narrative would be. So there's this character in a sweet carriage carried by creatures with a walk cycle that kind of kicks ass. The character has a little bit of bendy bones going on, so they're enjoying the ride. I think the Germa clip just showed up in my Twitter feed, and the rest is history. History being an explosive view count while I was carsick in a van for a couple hours, so I capitalized on the animation by quickly throwing, get it? To get the plane thrower from comments. What a hit! Let's move on and clamber over this segue wreck to the next animation, Framed Starvation. This was the start of me really trying out sculpting, and I think this character was sculpted from scratch with no source model or anything. I mean, I think I drew a concept art on my phone, but that probably made the final result worse. Additionally, I also had a cheeky cylinder following the crawler to leave a visible trace in the sand. Standard animation from there, but damn does that burger look good. Sandy eyes. This was still the period where I was using Paint 3D to draw models, which may return. I reused the model from Hearty Meal, except this time I actually animated the mouth. Also set in a dark environment to try and make the lighting look a bit more interesting. Gotta vary up your style some, kids. Then the character makes some art, like in Charred. I'm not sure if that's really equivalent though. Regardless, having the sculpted charcoal across from the reused model from Ultimate Collectables is neat, bit of a contrast. I also added a soft aura of smoke around the char to make it look a bit more strange. The collision with the canvas has it turn into a beautiful charcoal sketch done in Clip Studio Paint with a very silly transition done in Premiere Pro. Multiple characters in one scene is a bit weird, so it's good to have them just not interact at all, like the second person. The TV show is basically just Columbo. Don't worry about that. It's also probably not a good idea to layer your own voice with your own voice that's slightly modified. The show was done simply, just drawing a few panels, assembling in Premiere, then importing that video as a plane with some emission. The TV light switching pink was initially an accident, as I meant for the video to just loop, but I think it works as a media disconnected thing, even if that isn't something you've encountered in Blender or Gary's mod or something. I just had to change the point that the video runs out to match with the faceplate's removal. The view screen on the scanner I used was just an image overlaid in Premiere Pro. Don't be afraid to do things the very, very easy way, kids. Speaking of things popping up, here's Garden Fence. I wrote in the description of that one some of the problems I had, which by now have long vacated my increasingly barren mind, so this section won't have the same gusto as I originally intended. That's another good lesson, kids. If you have passion and something to say, you should very quickly harness that energy. The gist of it is I went through many iterations trying to figure out the music, and in fact, here are some of the tracks that I threw out. The skybox has a weird dithering effect by Cool Clip Studio Paintbrush. More shape key animation, the environment used geonodes to look less manufactured. The fence took a while to figure out, but it still looks a bit weird. The rope was hand done and this sentence is too long. Moving on, I'm going to derail my segue again, this time deliberately, since I want to mention posture. Originally, the animation had the spelunky caveman grunting and coughing as the vocals instead of me grunting and coughing. Also, I forgot to set one of the models as smooth. I'll also mention an opposite experience of music in Amphibian's Posturn. That music rules and was great right out of the gate. That was perfect. I don't know why I'm bringing up the original script so much. This is technically the first and third time I'm writing this video, since I originally threw out the script at 700 words to talk about techniques instead, but it was too short and not particularly interesting, so now the video is longer and not particularly interesting, beyond getting to re-experience all of the animations again, which is something that I enjoy. I guess I'll talk about Gradual Reverie now. I'll just point to the motion line of the torch. Also, the wormhole looks good. Just a few lights peppered throughout a tunnel, and you send the camera down. It's pretty good. There's also the similar shattering effect that was used in Climate Traveler. Running a little low on what to say about each animation, since I don't want to repeat myself too much for people who are watching from beginning to end. So I think from here I'll just use the rest of my script that I wrote for the techniques and kill two birds with one stone. I'll be going through techniques and things that I do in a more educational way, kind of. To start with, let's begin with the seed for the animation. The idea. Ideas can come from many places. They can develop directly from some material. They can come from focusing on a thought and expanding upon it. And they can be very base level, or more abstract interpretations of ideas, or just funny ideas that can pop out at random. As for what ideas you should actually follow through with, that's a bit tougher. You could have an idea that means a lot to you, but means pretty much nothing to someone else, and just compare that to something that's pretty much universally relatable. But an idea is just a thought. How do we get it to a finished animation? Well, that can take a few routes as well. And by that I mean there's multiple stages of planning. Sometimes I draw full concept art. Sometimes I draw storyboards. Usually I just jump in head first. While figuring out the animation, something to consider is the complexity that the idea needs. Many of my animations are pretty stripped down scenes with just enough context to convey the idea of the idea. This is usually because of either me posting a video every week and poorly utilizing my time, or because the idea doesn't speak to me enough to warrant a full experience. Other times, when I'm motivated, the animation has a larger amount of life within it. You can also hand-wave some accusations by authorial intent depending on how vague your idea is. Detail is another thing to consider. Many of the characters in my animations are simple stickman-like forms made using a few vertices and the skin modifier, with some detailing to make them look more compelling. This detailing can be approached by adding accessories like clothes or faces, or can be achieved through sculpting the figure to be more interesting. Or just fully sculpting a character. Sculpting is great, especially for more organic animations like the clay ones I do. Another element of complexity is the environment the characters take place within. Does the scene require physical objects? Does the idea need background details to enrich this world you're building? Do you need to see the floor that the characters are walking on? I'll admit, I'm not very good at designing scenery, and usually don't bother given the amount of time they add to rendering length, the day before the animations do. On the other hand, what if the background is the only thing that's modeled? I occasionally do 2D sprites running around in a 3D environment, and for some reason I find that a bit easier. So yeah, style plays a big part in complexity. Moving on. I don't know what that was, sorry. Plenty of ideas will only require one character. But what if the idea needs another character? Or what if you want to just add more characters for the sake of it? The way I animate characters, keep in mind that I rarely plan out anything, is animating one character, then animating the other. Occasionally I might weave back and forth when I get bored of animating the first. Expanding on complexity in animation, let's say that you are animating, but your scene doesn't feel very alive. Have you been considering the animation principles? I can't name them all from the top of my head, even though I am currently reading a script and could have very easily looked them up. But a very easy way to make the scene more animated would be to squash and stretch. I usually do it with the add-on Animal, but you can do it with just the rig or with shape keys. Or if you're doing a 2D animation, you could just draw wider. That's probably everything that I have to say on animating. Let's move on to post-production. Sound is usually what I work on next, and then music. I've mentioned before, but I have my sound sources from games, stock CD sound effects, and Foley that I've recorded myself. Finding the right sounds for a scene is usually pretty fast, but sometimes none of the sounds really fit, especially if your scene is a bit removed from reality. I tend to arrange the sound in either Premiere Pro or FL Studio. I would suggest doing it in FL Studio or whatever DAW you use, because of the wider range of audio effects and pitch shifting, but doing it in Premiere is fine since it's just a one-stop shop. When approaching the music, I usually have the tempo set to some multiplication of the frame rate. I don't think it really matters, but it's easier for me to sync up the score to punctuate moments. The music should also fit the style of the animation, so probably don't use like chiptune for more realistic animations. I guess it doesn't really matter, I don't know much about music. You could also do some color correction if you want it to look more filmic, but I don't know how much of an improvement it actually makes to a scene. Did I cover everything? No. In the weird improv-esque way that I approach creating media, it leaves me with many blank spots. Sorry.